So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and thank you so much for coming. If we can start with Bob, Dr. Robert Martin. You worked on the Pew Commission report. In fact, I think you led it. I think there were some significant conclusions that lead us to believe there is a direct link between the use of antimicrobials in food animal production and the rise in MRSA.
Right. I was the executive director of the Pew Commission on Industrial Farm Animal Production, which was a 2.5-year study commission funded by the Pew Charitable Trust with a grant to the Center for a Livable Future at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. We were a 15-member commission. We spent 2.5 years investigating all the issues in the areas of public health, environment, animal welfare, and rural communities associated with industrial farm animal production. The chairman of the commission was former Kansas Governor John Carlin, who had started life as a dairy farmer, started his professional career as a dairy farmer. Additional members of the commission were former Ag Secretary Dan Glickman, Bill Nyman of Nyman Ranches, Fidel Bauschio, of the president and CEO of Bon Appetit Management Company, Dr. Mary Wilson of the Harvard School of Public Health, and Dr. Marion Nessel of NYU. Our general finding was that industrial farm animal production is not sustainable. It represents an unacceptable level of threat to public health, an unacceptable level of damage to the environment. It is harmful to the animals themselves that are housed in the most restrictive confinement systems. And oddly enough, or kind of, you don't normally think of it this way, but it is to the long-term economic detriment of communities where they're located. So we came up with 24 consensus recommendations in those 4 areas, and our number one public health concern was the routine low-level use of antibiotics in industrial farm animal production. At the time, the government was not keeping very good statistics on the amount of antibiotics being used because the industry opposed that, both the pharmaceutical industry and the industrial animal ag sector. But it was estimated by public health officials that 70% of the antibiotics sold in the United States annually went into industrial food animal production. And they used the same antibiotics that are used in human medicine. Since the commission recommended banning the non-therapeutic use of antibiotics, the government has started keeping track, and that estimate was actually low. The real amount is 80% annually. And we found that was the reason why that was our number one public health concern was because of the driver that use caused in antibiotic resistance, making antibiotics, whether you eat meat or not, you're affected by that use of a community drug, and the routine low-level use in food animal production is making them less effective in people. So we recommended banning the non-therapeutic use of all antimicrobials, and the Pew Charitable Trust started an effort to seek to gain that ban either through legislation or through FDA regulation, Federal Food and Drug Administration regulation. We're in the process now of pushing FDA to do that. They say they're going to come out with a new guidance, which is their bureaucratic term for voluntary guidelines that the industry should follow. And it wasn't just the Pew Commission that said this use is a real problem for human health. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, the Federal Food and Drug Administration, Center for Veterinary Medicine, and even the USDA has said that this routine low-level use does link to resistance in people. And what we're finding in a lot of the areas where these operations are concentrated, there are higher rates of resistant staph infections, multi-resistant, or staph that's resistant to a multitude of antibiotics. So, I mean, there is a direct link, more than the industrial companies would like to admit, between this use and human health consequences.
Well, thank you so much. Megan, a very interesting resume and background. You have an MBA in business strategy, and yet you're working for GW on sustainability. How does that fit together in terms of delivery and where you're looking to take it?
I guess I would say that my career has been about helping organizations become more sustainable. And so that's how the transition from corporate sector to higher education was able to take place. And there's some of the speakers received a book in our packet about animal behavior and human behavior, and I think our behavior as organizations is pretty transferable, whether you're at a small nonprofit, which I've worked at small nonprofits before, or large organizations like a university or a company. So, but that transition has allowed me to see how difficult it is to make change, and moving large ships in a different direction takes a lot of time and a lot of commitment. And so being here at GW from the food perspective, I think our biggest driver for change has been our students, and they've really been the ones to seed that change around food.
Thank you so much. And Dr. David Love. Guys, is this one off now? Okay. David, you're sort of fairly young by most of our standards of the gentleman on this stage, going a little bit grey here. But you've done some sort of pretty amazing things looking at antimicrobials and how they work. I mean, just share a little bit of how you ended up where you are, because I know you're with Johns Hopkins and they do some really great things looking at antimicrobial resistance, but just give a little bit of insight as to how you've got to where you are.
Sure. Well, that's a great question. When I was sitting down here watching clips of Food Inc., I kind of had this flashback to several years ago. I was actually doing sort of the typical grad student research, not really focusing on the big ways that we can change the world. And I sort of had an aha moment, like, you know, my research can have a lot more impact if I'm actually going to do something that is relevant to today and not necessarily something that's relevant to what NSF once funded, you know, work funded, or what EPA wants research done on. And I was actually standing in the ticket line to watch Food Inc. In 2009, and I got a phone call from a group, actually my current employer, who I interviewed with a couple months earlier. Today I work for Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. It's sort of like a think tank within Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. We do research on all different aspects within the food system. I primarily work on food animal production, also on aquaculture. And I was standing in line waiting to see Food Inc. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, and the director of the Center for a Livable Future called me and said, "We'd like to hire you to join the center, join the work we're doing." And I accepted right there in the ticket line, went in, watched Food Inc. I got really pumped up, really excited, and for the 2 years since then, I've been doing work at Hopkins, doing my research, and basically pointing my career in the direction of what are ways that we can improve our food system by tackling some of the big problems in the way we raise animals. So thank you for kind of giving us, the young scientists, a charge.
Well, we need scientists to come up with the truth of what's really happening, and that's how we're going to make changes.
Well, that was a change I didn't know Food Inc. had ever made. So Jessica, an environmental epidemiologist. That sounds absolutely, well, I mean, it's epidemiology being the study of disease, but more specifically, your current work is to some of the emerging diseases coming from our, and I quote here, industrial food animal production systems.
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure to be up here talking with all of these very extremely interesting people. So I am an environmental epidemiologist. I work here at GW at the School of Public Health and Health Services. And my research, as Andrew said, is about emerging infectious diseases from the industrial production of food animals. And I was trained at Hopkins, and so it seems like we have some of these strong connections up here. But my research largely focuses on industrial food animal workers as kind of the canaries in the coal mine. When you look at this problem more on a broader scale perspective, I'm focused on emerging infectious diseases. So these are the populations in the developed world who have intense exposure to enormous populations of industrial produced livestock. And we know that there's a lot of particular strains of diseases that circulate within livestock populations. And so these industrial food animal workers who are working in slaughter, who are working in processing, who are working on the farm, and also individuals who are working in transport, who transport live animals from the farm to slaughter, people who work in disinfection or transporting manure around for different sorts of manure transport programs. These are the workers who have this critical exposure to both the animals that are potentially infectious, also to waste, which has become a big issue in my work in the last few years. Animal waste, which often can have viable levels of infectious bacteria and pathogens in them. And you can transport it around on people's shoes, on cars, and people can be exposed that way. So my research is largely focused at this nexus between animals in this country and the human population more generally, looking at this worker population. In the last few years, I've been focused almost exclusively on influenza viruses, on avian and swine influenza viruses, and industrial food animal workers as this nexus between the animals transferring these emerging strains of flu to the community and the emergence of pandemic flu through this industrial food animal system. More recently, I've been involved in researching drug-resistant staph infections. And since 2003, there was a particular strain of this MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, that was observed in people who work with pigs and the pigs themselves. And I've been studying this particular strain of MRSA in pig workers, and I'm starting a study in this country, in Nebraska, to be looking at slaughterhouse workers that may be exposed to this pathogen. And then transitioning to think about what might be the implications for the community at large for these diseases that emerge in worker populations.
Just sort of help me out a little bit in an argument I'm having currently. Do your initial results suggest there is any correlation between antimicrobial use in hogs, for instance, and MRSA?
And MRSA?
Yes.
There is evidence to suggest yes. I mean, there certainly are new strains of MRSA emerging into the population at large that are linked to MRSA strains that are found in food animals, and only food animals largely. So people who carry these particular strains of MRSA are people who have contact with populations of animals. I think we'll talk about this more generally in the panel, but the use of antibiotics more generally in food animal production does contribute in significant ways as a driver of resistance, bacterial resistance more generally in public health.
Now, Robbie, do you want to let us know exactly who you are and why you might need to be on the panel? Or do we know you well enough already?
I mean, this is certainly a subject that I think is really important, interests me. I just know as a child, I remember I had an earache, and my doctor discouraged us from using antibiotics because they said it should only be used when there's an emergency, and that it's too precious a drug to use unless it's absolutely necessary, and talked about all the diseases that were cured by these miracle drugs, and now we're using such vast amounts of these antibiotics on animals that I think that's a real concern, that we're putting, 70%, some large number, of antibiotics are going towards healthy animals, and something seems wrong to me.
Thank you. So Bob, you've done a lot of work on antibiotics. Let's speak to sort of diseases like E. coli and Salmonella, and just with your own experience, sort of speak a little bit to where you think E. coli's come from, how it's evolved, how it's become so resistant to any treatment, and whether any part of the food system may or may not have been sort of responsible for making that happen.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of areas. Resistant salmonella, I don't know if you followed the news, but recently I think it was 36 million pounds of meat was recalled because it was found to have drug-resistant salmonella, and it's sickened hundreds of people around the country, and with several deaths. And
Someone's leaning on a button somewhere, I think.
I think words got out. The industry
Right,
are,
that was
the industry want us to be quiet if we could, please.
Time for me to go.
Doc, Bob.
And so there were direct links shown between routine use in poultry production and the multi-antibiotic resistant strain of Salmonella. But it's interesting, I mean, most living animals have a strain of E. coli in them. What's been the real problem is when we moved away from all grass-fed beef production to finishing beef cattle in feedlots, feeding them a very high hot ration of protein grain, that it's led to them, they're not designed to ingest grain, cattle are not. And so if you feed them something other than grass, they develop abscesses, and one way to in their liver, and one way to offset that when they're in the feedlot is you give them antibiotics, and it's probably given at the most dangerous stage of the beef cattle production model too, because they're in the feedlot for maybe 30, maybe up to 80 days, fattening because Americans like the taste of meat, or they think they like the taste of meat that's finished on grain, and so it's right before they go to slaughter, and so that's the most dangerous time in the production cycle of cattle to feed them antibiotics, even though there are set withdrawal periods mandated by the FDA. You'll see if you go to a slaughter facility, they take for live feedlot beef, they take extraordinary steps to try to kill the E. coli that may be on the carcass or on the outside of the animal by acid washes and that sort of thing. But the problem is if their intestines may rupture at the wrong time in the processing, then you can contaminate the entire carcass. So there's a very direct link between the way we use it in beef production and resistant strains of E. coli 0157.
David, I know you and I just recently had the pleasure of working together, and we worked on feed blocks, the little mineral blocks that we often see in farmers' fields when they're fed from their young. And for those of you that haven't gathered, I'm not a Native American, and like all Brits, we have a lot of rules. And we have to get a veterinary prescription if you want to use antibiotics on a farm animal. And as part of our program looking into the standards, we had a number of non-compliances under our farmers, which meant that we have a position on antibiotics. And they were coming from animal licks or feed blocks, which are little blocks of nutrients put in the field. Could you speak a little bit today what sort of went on and what we were finding?
Sure. Well, maybe about a year and a half ago, Andrew contacted me and other folks that I work with and mentioned this issue of feed blocks, and we instantly picked up on it with a lot of curiosity and sort of academic interest. But it's more than just academic. There's some real problems going on, and it gives you insights into, by looking at how animals are fed and how they're fed antibiotics, it can give you some insights into what are the differences between, let's say, when we take antibiotics, we are, you go to your doctor for a particular bacterial infection, you might get a course of antibiotics like a pill bottle. Your doctor says, take one of these a day until you finish the pill bottle, right? You got to finish the pill bottle, or your Z-Pack or whatever. When animals are given antibiotics, especially animals that are raised in confinement, that they're not easy to individually medicate, like pigs and chickens, it's virtually impossible to go out there and find every chicken in a chicken house to give them a shot or a pill. It's just not done. So how animals are, especially chickens and pigs, are fed, and cattle in feed blocks, is they're fed in their food. So antibiotics are blended into their food, and it's also put into their water, their drinking water. So we looked into this issue of how animals are fed, and it was really quite alarming. If you can imagine any of these confinement facilities, if you're a chicken and you're supposed to be drinking so many milliliters of water to get your particular dose, or you're supposed to eat so many grams of feed per day, well, what if you're a runt? You might get pushed out of the way. What if you're injured or you're sick? You may not feel like eating. A lot of these animals that are sick are the ones that need the medicine the most. And they're not going to be eating and getting the proper dose of antibiotics to treat infections, let alone a lot of antibiotics are used for growth promotion only. So, you wonder, why do we get all these antibiotic-resistant bacteria that evolve in food production animals? Well, let's look at how animals are being fed, the method they're being fed. I don't think a veterinarian would really approve of these kinds of practices without really thinking long and hard about, is this in the animal's best interest? And in some cases, it might be in the animal's best interest, but in a lot of cases for growth promotion, for feed efficiency use for antibiotics, it's really not in the animal's best interest.
I mean, it was stunning for us to discover that this lick was put in the middle of a field and the animal just went to it, licked it, and it might have got antibiotic or might not. So tell me a little bit, Megan, in terms of where you're going and from what you're hearing, what would be your sort of focus on potential steps away from the system we currently have?
Focus on
Steps to get away from the system we currently have.
I always tend to focus on what's possible and what's innovative, what can we imagine to be different, and aspiring for that. So I think it's an appropriate question. And I also like to ask questions, well, why? I'm wondering why. Why are we doing these antibiotics? What's the root cause of that issue there? And we can monitor the impacts and monitor the damage and understand that and document that we need to, but really asking the question of why are we doing that and trying to address that root cause, I think, is critical to change. In terms of how we step away from this system, I love the idea of the neighborhood designed around a farm. Here at GW, we have a couple different campuses. This one you're on now is called the Foggy Bottom campus. And as you might know, it used to be a swamp, so that's where it gets the name. And what we're trying to do here is think about how we can integrate better as an institution with the urban ecosystem and how we can replicate and enhance ecosystem services that are provided or that we can provide in a built environment. So I think in a world where quickly we are becoming more and more living in urban centers, what we're trying to do is model, well, what can you do in an urban environment? And our students have initiated a garden that's probably more like a farm, a small farm on campus, and we're looking to do that on our own other campuses as well. So that's just one small way that we're looking to make change. But there's lots of potential in the city, and there's lots of potential on rooftops and in open spaces. What gets in the way of that are things like zoning, antiquated laws, red tape, but those are things that as a large institution you have some ability to navigate and try to influence.
That's a really interesting point on the grounds that a lot of us in the room are advocating for more red tape and more regulation about the use of antimicrobials and how our food animals are raised, and yet there appears to be some red tape. And I wrote recently about a young man in California who dug up his front yard, and the city took him to court to plant grass and water it instead of just growing these great vegetables for his kids. So an interesting challenge in terms of the system. Jessica, interestingly, I mean, you're looking at this from the point of view that you're finding evidence from these diseases in your early part of your research. Do you have a view on how we might change the source or change your findings?
I do. I think I wanted to, in bridging to that topic, I wanted to just talk for a minute about the use of growth promoters, of antibiotics as growth promoters in livestock in this country and in other parts of the world. It's the primary use of antibiotics, and I've spoken to integrators, which are the corporate entities that coordinate the growth and the process and the slaughter of animals. And they always focus on growth promoters not being the central use of antibiotics in livestock. But statistically, it really is. And so these are drugs that are given to animals that are otherwise healthy. And the focus is on, as David is suggesting, efficiency of feed. So the idea is that if you provide animals with low levels of antibiotics throughout the growth cycle, it will kind of kill whatever they might acquire during the growth process and allow them to transfer the food that they're receiving into energy in a more efficient way. And there's been evidence to suggest that, one, this might not actually be the case, that there might not actually be increased efficiency from the use of this process. And growth promoters have been banned in Europe a number of years ago. And over the course of the last 5 years, there's been research to suggest that both there has not been an economic downside in the slightly longer term to the removal of growth promoters, of antibiotics as growth promoters in Europe. And also you haven't seen illness in animals as might be expected. And when you look from a scientific perspective, the idea of providing subtherapeutic, as David is saying, or non-therapeutic doses of animals throughout portions of their life, it exerts a selection pressure on the bacteria within that animal population to adapt to this bacteria. So this encourages the development. It's an evolutionary process that's encouraging the development of bacteria that are resistant to whatever you're applying to this animal population. So in terms of solutions for things that might address this issue, eliminating the use of subtherapeutic antibiotics in livestock production is a major one. And this isn't to say that you need to eliminate all use of antibiotics in veterinary medicine, which is not something a lot of us would push for. But this use of subtherapeutic, non-medically guided use of antibiotics would be one thing. Another thing I would suggest is to really focus on these food animal worker populations through increased surveillance. Right now, people who work on farms, people who work in slaughter and processing are largely invisible to the general public and also to the surveillance structure in this system that looks for emerging infectious diseases. Many of these workers might not be documented, many of them might not speak English, many of them might be transient and might move, might be migrant or seasonal based on different sorts of employment, different times of the year. And so they're a very difficult population to capture and to focus and to do surveillance on. But I think it's very important. And so some of the regulatory structures that look at who we surveil, who we look at for these diseases, I think could be refocused in some ways on this population as well. I think another solution, or not a solution entirely, but something that's very important, is to think about what we do with animal waste in this country. So you have hundreds of thousands of animals that are raised in confinement in very small geographic areas, and often very intensely in the same geographic regions in this country. So you can have the equivalent of a city of livestock, a city of chicken, a city of swine, a city of cattle in a very small confined area with an equivalent of no septic or no sewage for the waste that these animals are produced. Most animal manure is land applied or held in lagoons, which makes it sound like very tropical, but a lagoon is just a manure pit that's water. And so most of the waste is either applied on land or held in a manure pit without any sort of treatment. And the farmers, the individual farmers, are responsible for dealing with the manure, and they're responsible for any sort of runoff or environmental contamination that happens as a result of this manure, the application of the manure. The integrators, the producers, are not responsible, but the producers set the terms of production. The producers say, this is the number of animals you have to raise in your facility. This is the type of facility you have to construct. These are the inputs. This is the feed. This is the antibiotics. This is the amount of water that you need to structure your system around. But we're not responsible, as Robbie is suggesting, for the externality of the waste. And as we come to learn that the waste can hold high levels of infectious material, as well as cause a lot of environmental pollution, this waste is something that needs to be dealt with. And my feeling is that the integrators and the producers need to take control of this externality. They need to take responsibility. And this is something that would have to be done through regulation.
I have a question. Sure. What did the industry say was the reason they're using these antibiotics?
The integrators say largely that it's done for treatment of animals. I think there is an argument, too, that the growth promoters are done to improve feed efficiency.
But if the animals are not sick, why do they need to, do they respond to that?
They
or-
do. I mean, their theory is that it's increasing. So you can give an animal that it's in part responsible for the decreased cost of food over the last 50 years.
Right.
That you can give an animal a certain amount of food, and they can create more energy from that same amount of food if their body is not using energy to combat pathogens that they're encountering in this system of 10,000 genetically identical chickens, for example. So, yeah.
Being with those chickens that Carol used to have and seeing them not move, they didn't look like a normal life form that I've ever encountered.
Yeah,
I can see how they might need that antibiotic.
Yeah, I mean, this is a human-made environment. These confined animal operations are a human-made environment, not a natural environment by
I'd say
humans.
an inhuman.
Inhuman, yes. Yes, it's something of our creation.
Yeah.
To point out the volume of waste just produced in the Delmarva Peninsula, the Pew Environment Group just released a report a month ago called Big Chicken, and it was a look at the evolution of the poultry industry over the last 50 years. The average size operation in the Delmarva Peninsula is about 600,000 birds, and they produce about 550 million broilers a year. That's the chicken we eat. And though that production produces enough waste to fill the Capitol Dome with chicken litter once a week, week after week after week, year round. So about 52 times filling the Capitol Dome a year just from the Delmarva Peninsula. And so Jessica is exactly right. That's a very small area. There's a real problem with phosphorus buildup in the land, which in the long term will make the land less productive. There's a real problem with runoff into the Chesapeake Bay of nitrogen and other sediments. So she's exactly right. And the big companies, the integrators, aren't liable. They aren't co-liable for the disposal of the waste. And if you ask producers over there or the companies, they'll say, well, there's a value to the waste. It's, smells like money to them, so they don't have to apply chemical, artificial fertilizers. But the fact of the matter is, there is so much there, it's become a disposal problem.
If I might, I think hearing all this, if I were just a general consumer, and maybe some of you are thinking this way, well, how do I know what I'm getting, and what are my other alternatives? And I think that's the tough choice we all face in the way our society is structured right now. A lot of the reason things are developed the way they are is because we're looking at a free market to a certain extent where competition rules to a certain extent until there is more control by one particular organization or another. And then there are regulatory measures taken, right, to try and create something for the better good, but then there's unintended consequences of that, and greed and selfishness can take a play there. But as a consumer, we do have a certain power, and our students, in particular the Food Justice Alliance, we have a food working group, have expressed, and I think as students you have an opportunity to express your wishes and your desires and how you would like things to be different. And as a result, we've seen some big changes on our campus in terms of what kinds of food is offered in our institutional entities, including what we have here from Sodexo. And we're also seeing students, developing their own Meatless Monday type events. We were talking about this earlier. But as a consumer outside of a university setting, I think the question that Robbie brought up earlier around, well, what do we know is in our food? Transparency and accountability are critical for us as a society to say, okay, we know what's in our food, we know how our food is being made, and now we can hold certain parties accountable. And I think those are the two things we really need to have as consumers to signal a different kind of demand and to signal a broader change. But transparency and accountability don't come easily, and so voicing a need for those or desire for those, I think, is critical.
That's great. That's an absolutely phenomenal answer, and one of the things I think you've got in your packs is a labeling guide I had done for me so I could understand labeling, and it's rightly labeled by my team, the labeling guide for dummies, being as I'm the dummy they made it for. Just speculate slightly, though, that if we look back at our food systems and we look at cattle, we look at their herbivores, and we look at sheep, they're herbivores. And we look at poultry, they're omnivorous, and we look at hogs, they're omnivorous. And generally, nature designed them to live in smaller groups, slightly farther away from each other, and certainly not, I mean, we know that poultry are coprofacial, so chicken eat their own fecal matter, thank you. And what would happen if we designed a system perhaps that didn't make animals sick, didn't make their livers have lesions, didn't require them to be routinely treated, even if it was because they came ill? Do you think that's achievable? Do you think that's something we could look to? And more importantly, do you think that could lead toward the solution? And I say that because the World Health Organization said that marginal pastoral production had a role to play, not only in decreasing antimicrobial resistance, but it also, I think, said something along the lines of it could potentially feed the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the answer, at least in part, lies in a discipline called agroecology, which is basically reintegrating livestock production with grain production. So it will require more people involved in agriculture. The Pew Commission like that concept of more people being involved in agriculture. So I think there's a lot of progress being made in the agroecology sector. There's a whole discipline in California in the state school system where the land grant system out there is looking at ways to do that. It's been particularly of interest in South and Central America. And, you know, the Millennium Institute did a report a few years ago called Agriculture at the Crossroads. And they showed that we're now producing enough calories for about 10 billion people. It's just the fact that what we're raising and how we're using those calories and the processing and distribution system is askew. So to talk about, oh, we have to intensify agriculture even more to feed 9 billion people in 50 years is really kind of a false statement, that we just need to look at systems change to better utilize water, to better utilize land, to involve more people in agriculture.
Time is upon us. Just going to come around if we could. Megan.
Just to close out?
Just to come into my question and then into Q&A. I'm just getting the 5-minute signal from the wall, and they're going to shoot me if I run along.
I guess my closing thoughts would just go back to this accountability transparency thing. I think as we continue to demand accountability and transparency, I think we will get it. There are lots of options for addressing some of these larger systemic problems once I guess I'm promoting more of a grassroots organizational approach. Like, let's figure out ways that we can consolidate concerns and have a voice that's louder than just me, myself, and I, and signal those concerns at a higher level.
I would say we have to look at what we're exporting, what ideas we're exporting to the rest of the world. A lot of folks internationally have picked up on factory farming as what they think the next model of food production, the next green revolution, what have you. And that's actually happening in a lot of places in Eastern Europe, in Southeast Asia. We have a study in Thailand with pig farms in Thailand. Actually, China is buying pig farms in northern Thailand, which is quite startling, and using factory farming methods. So we need to reshape the way we're producing animals, because we need to start exporting a better way to do it. We don't need to continue to be pushing this factory farming approach. It's even started in aquaculture. You know, fish are raised the same way in water now that chickens are raised in confinement in chicken coops. So we need to really be leaders in the U.S. so that we can sort of snub out some of the problems that have happened in the last 10, 15 years.
I would very much agree and reiterate what I think everyone on the panel has said, is that this is really a systemic issue. This isn't something where you can say, I'm a vegetarian, I'm opting out of this problem. If there's emergence of new diseases, of pandemic diseases, of drug-resistant bacteria. This isn't something that by not eating certain foods you can opt out of. This is something that we are all involved together as a society, as a global society, with these problems. And so the changes need to happen on the systemic level. Something I've been thinking about fairly recently is the idea of carrying capacity in particular regions in this country specifically when it comes to industrial food animal production. And can you take an area, for example, of Delmarva and impose a zoning constraint that has an eye towards public health, an eye towards emerging diseases, an eye towards the health of workers and farmers, and say, this is the amount of animals that can be raised in this area, rather than it's more of a free-for-all, however many you can fit into a poultry house that you can, that you can construct. So the idea of kind of reshaping this idea of carrying capacity in a zoning way, in a regulatory way in certain areas of this country is something I've been thinking about recently in terms of what could be stepping towards the solution. But it is something that involves, that's really an issue involving everyone.
I love that we have zoning where you can't have one rooster, but you can have, 100,000 chickens. So it seems slightly off balance. For me, I think, again, how do we feed the world? If you look at the majority of our land being used for corn and soy, and that corn is now, I think, I'm forgetting the statistic, something like 40% is going towards ethanol and 50% is going towards animal feed. So of the vast majority, we're not feeding, we're not taking advantage of that great land that we have towards feeding human beings, ultimately. It's a very inefficient system, and yet we're being told this is the only way to feed the world. I think something's off. Also because we're becoming more susceptible to new diseases in the way that these animals are being raised. So we have to reconfigure a more sustainable system.
No, I think that's the summary I would have given, actually. I think we've got to just take a long, hard look at what we're doing. And the key thing I'm hearing is this whole scientists want to use regulation, business doesn't. There has to be a middle way. The rest of the world has managed to sort of attack this, and to your point, China is talking about controlling antibiotic use in food animal production. And I think my thing is the European model, they don't stock their animals at the incredible densities we do, which is just something phenomenal.
Hi, John Godano from Back Creek Bend Farm. We do grass-fed beef and pastured poultry. And I'm hearing a lot of very good positive things and great information, but sometimes I'm a little concerned about the solutions that may come out of it. And I guess where I'm getting with this is folks on your level will be the ones that lobby for laws to be passed, possibly to solve some of these problems that we're seeing. And then by the time that they're filtered through politicians and through the industry groups, they suddenly, the output, or the manure, ends up actually hurting the small farmer. And some of these things are already happening. There's crackdowns on farmers markets, and there's more and more demands made on small farmers as to what they need to show in their labeling and things like this. And so I'm wondering, and maybe the panel can discuss this, if education is more important than anything, any laws we could pass. Obviously there are externalities, and those are real, and we need to look at those and find ways to deal with those. But if you look at the Food Inc. movie was one of the best marketing ventures for my company. Lots of people have called me up saying, I just watched Food Inc. and I need to get some grass-fed beef from you. And so I really appreciate that. But I guess just to the ideas of sometimes we need to be very careful as to how we approach these problems so that we're not actually then suffocating even more the smaller enterprises.
Well, can I just as the director of a program, we write standards, and they're rules and regulations, and for all intents and purposes, they speak to exactly what you're speaking. There are things you can and cannot do. We empathize completely with your position. We understand it totally. But the challenge is to fix the planet, to fix the mess, you have to make rules for the bad guys. The side effect, the unintended consequence of making rules for the bad guys is the guys that are doing it right suffer. But let me hazard a guess, and if all the feminists in the room want to beat me to death, in business there is the glass ceiling. And women have to be 20 times better than men to break through the glass ceiling. Sustainable alternative farmers have to be 20 times better than the industry to crack that glass ceiling. But I promise you, once that glass ceiling has gone, and Robbie's done his job, and all the information we've had from these folks gets into the public domain, then that change will happen. I don't think we can stop people trying to get regulation in order to, the issue is too huge. Our water is almost undrinkable in our rivers. Our land is almost unfarmable. And billions of animals are suffering because industry wants to make a profit, not because they want to feed the world. We already heard from Bob, the world is eminently capable of feeding itself if we stop being fat and eating more than we should and give that to other nations.
I would just say that the manure on your farm is an asset, is where the manure in CAFOs becomes a great liability. So when you do talk about externalities, I think you are talking about trying to figure out systems that work. And small farms have advantages over mega farms. They might be more expensive when you go to the cashier and pay for it at the cashier, but they are ultimately less expensive for communities and all down the line. So I think if people start to understand externalities, they are going to become more sympathetic to farmers such as yourself.
Yeah, I would just add, too, that the Economic Research Service at USDA has done a report. They released it in January of 2009 with regards to antibiotic use in food animal production. And there's a direct correlation between size of operations and abuse of antibiotics or misuse of antibiotics. So the smaller producer who, like yourself, grass-fed producer, uses antibiotics appropriately should not be impacted. But when the Pew Commission was looking at all our recommendations, we didn't dive deep into the subsidy structure of American agriculture, but our general rule of thumb was, if it's going to benefit society and smaller producers are going to benefit society, then the subsidy structure that the country uses to support agriculture needs to be looked at. So there's a level playing field. That's one of the reasons why we said one of our primary recommendations to help rural communities was to fully enforce the antitrust laws in the country. And the Obama administration is about ready to promulgate a rule called GIPSA for the Grain Inspection, Packers and Stockyards Administration to try to address some of those inequities that what Robbie's film pointed out, 4 companies basically controlling all the meat production and slaughter in the country.
Hi, I'm Bob Fry. I'm a large animal veterinarian on the Delmarva Peninsula, so I know a lot about what I've heard spoken about here this morning. I'm also a small dairy farm producer, and we produce milk and grass-fed beef and meadow veal. And so I have a comment and then a question. The comment is around a question I think Andrew asked Jessica about what did the large integrators think of the massive antibiotic use in food animal production. And my comment is that there's some confusion over the definition of antibiotics. The integrators say antibiotics are only used for treatment purposes. Okay. In the food animal industry, from the integrator to the producer, the broad scale use of antibiotics, namely ionophores that are used for growth promotion, are not really considered antibiotics. They are antimicrobials, and in their most clear definition, they are antibiotics. But if you ask a farmer if he's using antibiotics and he is using ionophores, he's going to say, no, I'm going to use it to treat an animal when it's sick. Same with the integrators. So definition is key there when we're talking about what are antibiotics and what are antimicrobials. The question I have is for anyone in the group there. As we move away from industrial, large-scale agriculture, and I am one of those, we only have a 55-acre farm, it's just 2 people that work there. The question we often ask ourselves is, who's going to do the work? In the United States today, our social structure is such, people aren't going to muck stalls, people aren't going to milk cows, people aren't going to pick the lima beans. Who's going to do that work as we move away from the efficiencies of labor that do exist in large-scale production agriculture? Thank you.
Thank you. If I may take that one into 2 pieces, because I think you made a key statement there. The role of ionophores, he says, looking at Dave and Jessica here, the role of ionophores in antimicrobial resistance. There's a nuance between what is an antibiotic and what is an ionophore, and I know Bob Lawrence was talking in great depth the other day that even the ionophores have a role to play in antibiotic resistance.
Yeah, I could just address a little bit the ionophore role. This is a good point. There are a lot of ionophores being used. One thing to understand about how antibiotic resistance works in bacteria is that you can give, drug X, tetracycline and you may not get out tetracycline resistant bacteria. So if you're giving ionophores, you may not get resistance to ionophores, but it may contribute to the larger antibiotic resistance resistome on the farm, in the community. You may be contributing to other types of antibiotic resistance by using ionophores. Ionophores are antimicrobials. So antibiotics, by definition, are...
Do you want to give us some examples of what an ionophore might be?
Yeah.
Sulfur?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are going, what on earth is an ionophore, including me?
Yeah. Well, that's because we don't use them a lot in human medicine, so they're not particularly relevant to us. Antibiotics are, by definition, they're these drugs that were naturally occurring in the soils, like penicillin, those sorts of things. Antimicrobials are human-made drugs, and certainly ionophores are a human-made drug. So, ionophores are being used widely. Maybe they're...
Here's where I first spotted ionophores, when I went into a so-called natural chicken house. And in your stomach, there's various things that go on, and one of them is the acids will kill the bacteria, and scientists correct me if I've got this completely wrong. But if you change the nature of your stomach to make it more acid or more alkaline, it'll kill the bacteria. So what they've done in poultry production to make it all natural is to take out the tetramycin or the amoxicillin, and they've gone and put in copper sulfate. And the sulfate actually is the antimicrobial activity. So the system's still wrong, it's still broken, they still have to treat the chickens, they're just treating them with something else that can't be called an antibiotic. It's an ionophore. And I think the work coming out from Bob Lawrence said that ionophores are having a role in antibiotic resistance in the same way as antibiotics are. Does that sound right?
Yeah, it does. And maybe the second part of this question, how do we... Does somebody want to take this on?
Well, I just wanted to add about the antimicrobials. The Pew Commission dealt with the difference between antibiotics and ionophores. Since they're all antimicrobials, we said you can't use antimicrobials non-therapeutically because of that interrelation between ionophores and antibiotics. So, and it does still mask a broken system. So we had the dean of the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville was one of our commissioners. He'd been a large animal vet before he went into academia. So we kind of dealt with it on a more simple level of just banning all antimicrobials non-therapeutically.
On the second part of the question, Joel Saladin had said to me when we were talking, that all the A and B students have left the farm. And it's just the D and F students that stick around. And that ultimately we've so devalued labor, and it's just so looked down upon in this country. And if we are going to transform this food system, we're going to need vastly more farmers. Right now we have so few people, and they are invisible people, many of them illegal. And we're going to have to sort of appreciate and probably have to pay more money for this food. But maybe we won't be wasting 40% of it as we are now. Maybe it's because it's so cheap, we throw it away. And maybe we can start to value the food and value the labor more than we do at the moment.
I'm just going to speak from a more philosophical, personal perspective on that last question. For some reason, when you were posing the question, I went to Catholic school for 12 years. I consider myself a recovering Catholic. I still go to church once in a while. But the whole rule of do unto others, and it keeps coming into my head how we're thinking about treating animals, how we're thinking about our workers, and the A and B students have left the farm. My family is all farmers, and my mother and her 7 siblings grew up very poor farmers, and I have 23 cousins, and I think only one of them is still farming. And and I've done dirty work, and I think a lot of us in this room do dirty work, and there is something to be said for that, and something for a certain level of humility that we have to take on as a society, as individuals, as we look at the food we eat, the animals we're raising, and the people who are harvesting that food. So I don't have an answer, but something along the lines of, do unto others, and let's all put ourselves in that place of humility and think about what we need to do as individuals, as part of the society.
As I just want to say one more thing about the dairy production. As I travel around the country, I'm asked to speak to a lot of interesting groups. About 2 years ago, I was asked to meet with the professional dairymen of Wisconsin, I think, or they were based in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. They had members all over the country, and a state government person from Wisconsin came and talked about the dairy apprenticeship program they have, and they also have a farmland trust preservation program in Wisconsin, and every year they can take 100 people in the class to train them how to be dairymen or dairywomen. And they said that they traditionally have 2 and 3 times the number of applicants that they have spots to fill. And similarly, about a year ago, I spoke at Stone Barns in New York at a new and beginning farmer program. And they had 200 spots, and they opened it up nationwide. No advertising. It was all done through the internet. And they had 500 people that were just starting farming. And it's a different, it's not a 2,000 acre grain farm in the Midwest. It's 50-acre produce farm, maybe in a more temperate climate. But I guess my point is I think that there are people that are interested if we start to value food more.
But it's a struggle to get in because it's very expensive to become a farmer.
Yeah.
And we have to figure out how to support them.
Right.
I would agree, and I wouldn't be surprised, too, if there is some generational shift now in terms of people growing up, seeing Fast Food Nation as a teenager, seeing Food Inc., reading Fast Food Nation in these formative times in their career. I feel like I grew up, and the A&B students, everyone went into consulting from when I was in college. And that doesn't mean that everyone was happy in consulting. I think there is this sense of dissatisfaction with some of these away from the land job options, and when you have a generation of children who are growing up with more awareness of where their food is coming from and the problems that are involved in these systems, we might as well see people going back into farming.
And I think we also have to think about the pricing of food. We keep saying this may be more expensive if we're taking into account the externalities, but then how do we accommodate folks who can, I remember the story from your film, the family who could only afford to eat at McDonald's for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. How do we accommodate those kinds of incomes as well?
Though Mark Bittman sort of said, he thought we were wrong to say they could only afford that.
Okay.
Because you can get a crock pot, you can learn how to prepare meals. So if I didn't address sometimes people say, what would you have liked to have addressed in Food Inc.? And I would think that we can cook meals at home.
But even in some places, you can't even get to a grocery store.
It's really difficult, and we are targeting lower income people in communities where in these what we call food deserts are absolutely being targeted with this junk food.
Yeah.
And it's terrible. But ultimately, I think we have to promote you know, that people can cook at home, probably just as cheaply. But it takes time and it's hard to get that food. And we have to help make that happen.
One last question, if we may.
My name is Uli Benowitz. We have a brewery, which is not related to this, but also a butchery, and so we are involved in, most of our work is adding value for small farmers, so their beef and pork is not just sold as raw beef, but also as sausages, as pastrami, prosciuttos, because the word sustainability nowadays, quite honest, is completely overused. We need to talk about profitability. And I have worked with so many farmers who don't make any money. They are just idealists, and it's wonderful to work with them. But we've got to figure out a way of making small-scale farming profitable. That is the one issue. The other issue, of course, is the what do we do with 80% of the people who have no choice, who just got to buy the cheapest food possible? And they do go to the dollar store and buy food. And of course they're going to end up on dialysis if you do that. There is no question about it. But how do we, it's a social issue. How do we do this? How do we get, and I had on our facility, Senator Dole, former Elizabeth Dole, former Senator of North Carolina, came to see us. And she said the same thing, which is wonderful what you guys do, but how do you feed the masses? And my answer was, ma'am, on your way back, you will drive through a little town, rural town of North Carolina. They have 1,000 people living there. They have 7 fast food joints, and they have their own dialysis center for 1,000 people. And that's the political problem here. It is, for a politician, easy to promote cheap food for your voters. That is easy. But how do you promote a policy where you tell your voters you have to spend more of your money on something, but it'll save you money 30 years down the road? No politician will touch that with a 10-foot pole. And that's the problem with all this, is how do we translate that into a volume? We've got to figure out a way of making healthier food cheaper. And because it is cheaper if you take it on a 30-year, but it's not cheaper if you look at it for the next 3 weeks. That's the real problem, and I don't know how to address that.
I actually wonder if that question and or statement stands alone. The challenge is you help Robbie get his film to other people. NGOs work together to communicate that message. And I think if we can get that message to the populace, they'll do the right thing. I will challenge Robbie a little bit on the crock pot, though, because affording it is about having the time. And I think if you have to have 3 jobs to pay your rent, and you're required to have a cell phone in your kid's pocket, I don't know that you might have the money to buy the raw materials if you can find them. I don't know if you have the time while you're living the great American dream in the way we all live, which is to cut our kids everywhere. But on that note, I really appreciate it, but time is sort of running and we're heading out to lunch, if we may. You'll go to the back and I'll just finish this and then we can thank our panelists. Get a lunch box and then bring it back in, and then we'll move to listen to Helen York. But ladies and gentlemen, these have been great folks, and the aspiration of this panel was to bring some of the science to us all in a way that we could understand it, because I've been confused for quite a long time on what these issues are. So folks, thank you so much. Thank you.